Most people imagine the tabernacle as nothing more than a simple tent, standing in the middle of the desert. But what was built there was anything but simple. In fact, by every human standard, it should have been impossible. Out there in the sand, with no modern tools, no industrial system, no permanent structure, gold had to be heated until it melted at over 1,000 degrees. And it did. Every part had to work. Every measurement had to match. Every material had to be handled with precision. Nothing could be improvised. Nothing could be guessed. Nothing could be done halfway. Because this would not be just another shelter in the wilderness. This would be the dwelling place of the Creator of the universe among His people. When God gave Moses the pattern for the tabernacle on the mountain, He was not just giving him a list of dimensions, materials, and shapes. He was revealing a heavenly design. Moses saw something sacred, something divine, and what he saw had to be reproduced on earth with absolute accuracy. No shortcuts, no creative adjustments, no room for error. But that raises a serious question. Who was going to build something like that? The people waiting below the mountain were not famous craftsmen. They were not master builders from wealthy cities. They were men and women who had spent generations living under slavery. Their hands knew mud, straw, and bricks. They knew forced labor. They knew exhaustion. But goldwork, fine fabrics, sacred architecture, that was another world entirely. And yet Scripture says that God called Bezalel by name. Out of an entire nation, God appointed one man, and then did something extraordinary. He filled him with His Spirit, giving him wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and skill in every kind of craftsmanship. Think about that. God did not just assign a task, He empowered the man for it. But Bezalel could not do it alone. The tabernacle was too great, too detailed, too demanding for one person. So God also chose Oholiab to work beside him. And He gave both of them something just as important as skill, the ability to teach. That meant this was never going to be the work of a few gifted individuals. It would become the work of a people being transformed. So in the middle of the desert, something remarkable began to happen. Men who had spent their lives making bricks started learning how to carve wood. Others learned how to shape metal, work with fabric, grind pigments, and prepare materials for sacred use. The same hands once worn down by slavery began to move with precision. The same people once defined by bondage were now being shaped into builders of a sanctuary. And that may be one of the most powerful parts of this story. God was not just building a house. He was rebuilding a people. Then came one of the hardest challenges of all, the gold. God commanded that many parts of the tabernacle be made of pure gold. And that sounds beautiful when you read it quickly. But stop and think about what that actually meant. Gold does not become workable by accident. To melt it, you need extreme heat, real heat, the kind of heat that demands planning, fuel, coordination, and endurance. So how could a nation in the middle of the wilderness, without advanced furnaces or modern equipment, possibly reach those temperatures? The answer starts long before the desert. During their centuries in Egypt, the Hebrews did more than make bricks. They lived inside one of the most advanced civilizations of the ancient world. They would have seen metalworking, pottery, construction techniques, and large-scale craftsmanship up close. Even as slaves, they were surrounded by skills and systems that would leave an impression. Knowledge was in the air, but even that would not be enough on its own. Because knowledge is one thing. Actually producing heat in the Sinai wilderness is another. There was no convenient stockpile of hardwood, no industrial fuel source, no elaborate metal furnaces waiting to be used. But there was one natural resource that kept showing up in the desert landscape: acacia wood. At first glance, acacia hardly looked impressive. It was twisted, thorny, dry, and rough. But hidden inside that stubborn desert tree was exactly what they needed. When turned into charcoal, acacia burned hotter and longer than ordinary wood. Slow, steady, intense. And in a place like Sinai, that mattered. So imagine the process. Clay furnaces shaped in the sand, charcoal burning deep inside. Leather bellows pushing air into the flame again and again until the fire roared hotter and hotter. Men working in shifts to keep it going, feeding the fire, forcing air into it, watching the metal, waiting for the exact moment when gold could finally be worked. It was exhausting work, brutal work. Picture the desert heat already pushing past 40 degrees, the ground itself burning beneath your feet, the air so dry it scraped the lungs. And then, just steps away, furnaces throwing off waves of heat far beyond anything the body could comfortably endure. You could not stay there long without feeling your strength drain away. Tools had to be gripped through thick cloth. Molten splashes were a constant danger. Water was limited. Sweat disappeared almost as fast as it formed. And still the work had to continue, because the sacred objects could not be rushed. Every vessel, every ornament, every sacred piece required time. But among all those pieces, one stood above the rest in difficulty. The lampstand, the golden menorah. God's command for it was unmistakable. It was to be made from a single piece of pure gold, not assembled from parts, not welded together, not patched or attached piece by piece. One mass of gold, shaped and hammered until it became a finished lampstand. That meant one mistake could ruin everything. A temperature misjudged, a strike placed badly, a flaw hidden inside the metal, one crack in the wrong place, and the entire piece might have to be melted down and started again. And this was not a small ornament. It was made from a talent of gold, roughly 35 kilograms. That is a massive amount of precious metal to place into human hands, especially in a desert workshop run by people who had once been slaves. The pressure must have been enormous. The responsibility must have felt overwhelming. But maybe that is exactly the point, because while the gold was being refined in the furnace, the people themselves were being refined through obedience. With every hammer strike, they were learning something deeper than craftsmanship. They were learning reverence. Precision, patience, dependence. The fire was shaping more than metal. And then there was the wood. While some worked at the furnaces, another group had to prepare the structural framework of the tabernacle. This was the hidden skeleton that would hold everything together. And once again, the material God chose was acacia. Not cedar, not oak, not some elegant timber imported from a distant kingdom. Acacia. To the average person, that choice probably seemed strange. Acacia was crooked, thorny, difficult to cut, difficult to shape. It did not look like the kind of wood you would choose for sacred construction. But God was not asking for appearance. He was asking for endurance. Acacia resisted decay. It stood up to heat. It survived the desert. It was strong enough to bear weight and harsh enough to last where softer wood would fail. But working with it was no easy task. Each board had to be large, about 4.5 meters tall, and each one had to match exact measurements. That meant crooked desert trees had to be turned into straight, polished planks with no room for improvisation. Imagine trying to do that with primitive tools, sawing, scraping, smoothing, reworking the grain. Wrestling hard wood into clean, measured form, splinters tearing into worn hands, muscles burning from repetitive labor, hours turning into days over a single board, and they did not need just one or two, they needed dozens. Then came the detail that changes the whole picture. Once those rough acacia boards were completed, they were covered in gold. Think about what that means. Something twisted and ordinary was transformed into something radiant and sacred. What looked common on its own became part of the structure of God's dwelling place. That image is hard to ignore. The desert wood was still underneath, but now it was clothed in glory. From the outside, the tabernacle would not necessarily impress the world. It would look like a tent, simple, covered, unassuming. But inside, every detail spoke of heaven, holiness, and divine order. And all of it was taking shape through the labor of people who never should have been able to do it, except that God himself had called, equipped, and guided them. But building the tabernacle was never just about crafting beautiful pieces. Those pieces had to stand. They had to function together. They had to survive in one of the harshest environments imaginable. And that is where the story becomes even more impressive, because the tabernacle was not designed as a permanent building. It was not a stone temple with deep foundations buried in the ground. It was a mobile sanctuary. It had to be assembled, taken apart, carried, and raised again wherever the cloud of God stopped. That changes everything. Think about the challenge for a moment. You have tall wooden boards overlaid with gold, heavy materials, sacred furnishings, layered coverings, and an entire structure that has to remain stable on shifting desert ground. You cannot just place all of that directly on sand and hope it stands. The weight would push downward. The wind would push sideways. The ground would shift. The whole thing could lean, sink, or collapse if the base was wrong too. So how do you create stability in the wilderness without permanent foundations? God gave Moses an answer that seems simple at first, but the more you think about it, the more brilliant it becomes. Silver bases. Each wooden board had two tenons, like two lower projections shaped to fit into matching sockets, and every socket rested in a solid silver base. These were not decorative pieces. These were structural. They carried weight. They created balance. They held the framework in place without fastening it into the earth. Each one was heavy, roughly a talent of silver, around 35 kilograms. So now imagine the scene. Heavy silver bases laid across the desert floor in precise alignment. Gold-covered boards raised one by one and set into place. Everything measured. Everything fitted. Everything designed to work together without slack or imbalance. That is astonishing when you stop to consider it. No concrete. No buried supports. No iron anchors driven into the ground. Just carefully engineered weight, balance, and exact fit. It was a modular system centuries ahead of its time, but even that was not enough on its own. Tall walls need lateral support. So God also commanded that long bars of acacia wood, overlaid with gold, be passed through rings attached to the boards. These crossbars joined the walls together and turned the separate parts into one rigid structure. Without that, the walls might stand briefly, but not endure. With it, the entire framework became unified, a single coordinated body, a structure that could be assembled and disassembled repeatedly without losing its integrity. And that may be one of the most overlooked miracles of the whole tabernacle. It did not just stand once. It stood again and again and again. For 40 years in the wilderness, this sacred structure was raised, taken down, carried forward, and set up once more. That means the joints had to keep fitting. The bases had to keep aligning. The bars had to keep holding. The measurements had to keep working. Nothing drifted out of place. Nothing slowly became unusable. It remained stable because it had been built according to God's exact design from the very beginning. Now imagine the people building all of that before ever seeing the final result. They were handling boards, bases, rings, bars, sockets, fabric, and sacred furnishings, trusting that each part would matter, each detail would fit, and the whole would stand when the moment came. That takes faith. Hammer by hammer, board by board. They were obeying instructions whose full beauty they had not yet seen. And once the structure was ready, another layer of wonder entered the story, the fabrics. God did not ask for plain coverings. He asked for beauty. He asked for artistry. He asked for fine linen woven with blue, purple, and scarlet thread, with cherubim worked into the design. In other words, the inside of the tabernacle was meant to resemble heaven. This was not just shelter. This was sacred symbolism turned into craftsmanship. But that immediately raises another question. Where do you get those materials in the middle of the wilderness? Fine linen, rare colors, elaborate threadwork. This was not the kind of thing people casually produced in a desert camp. The blue and purple dyes in the ancient world were incredibly valuable. They came through difficult processes and were associated with royalty, wealth, and status. These were not common pigments. Yet Exodus tells us that the people brought these materials as offerings to the Lord. Most likely, These resources came out of Egypt when the Hebrews left, given into their hands on the night of departure. What Egypt had stored in wealth was now being poured out for worship. But owning the material was only the beginning. It still had to be worked, prepared, dyed, spun, woven, and that work fell especially to the skilled women among the people. Scripture honors them for a reason. They were not doing casual domestic labor. They were participating in sacred construction. Picture it: threads being spun by hand, fibers prepared, dyes mixed and applied again and again until the right shade was reached, fabric stretched, dried, reworked, and woven with care. And then the most extraordinary detail of all. The cherubim were not simply added afterward as decorative embroidery. They were part of the fabric itself. The design had to be planned into the weave from the start. That required incredible precision. Before a single section could be finished, someone had to think through the pattern, where each color would begin, where it would end, how the image would appear across the cloth, how to make repeated forms align without distortion. One error in counting or planning, and the image could come out crooked, broken, or imbalanced. So here you have women in the desert, without modern diagrams, without printed instructions, without the kind of tools later civilizations would take for granted, creating something with the complexity and elegance of royal tapestry. That is remarkable. The tabernacle was not only strong, it was beautiful, intentionally beautiful, and that contrast was built into its very design. From the outside, the tabernacle would appear covered, weathered, restrained, a tent. Nothing flashy, nothing outwardly overwhelming. But once inside, everything changed. Gold reflecting sacred light, rich colors woven into the curtains, cherubim overhead, beauty hidden within humility, glory concealed beneath simplicity. That pattern shows up again and again in Scripture, and here it was built directly into the sanctuary itself. Then there were the priestly garments. This is the point where many people think of clothing as symbolic and move on too quickly. But in the biblical text, the garments of the high priest were never casual accessories. They were holy garments. Yes, but they also carried a terrifying seriousness. Entering God's presence was not routine. It was dangerous. One mistake could cost a life. That means these garments were not just ceremonial. They formed part of the boundary between man and overwhelming holiness. Exodus 28 describes them in extraordinary detail. Every piece mattered, every thread, every stone, every fastening. The high priest would not approach God representing only himself. He would go in carrying the weight of a nation. The breastpiece alone reveals how serious this was. It held 12 precious stones, each one representing a tribe of Israel. These were not random decorations chosen to look impressive. Each stone had to be set properly. Each name had to be engraved, and engraving gemstones in the ancient world was painstaking work. It required skill, patience, abrasive material, steady hands, and time. Again, all of this was happening in the wilderness. Then the breastpiece had to be attached with gold chains to the priestly garments. That means the weight was not only symbolic, it was physical. The priest carried Israel over his heart as he came before God. Their names were literally upon him, their identity, their memory, their burden. Then came the blue robe, and perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, the bells on its hem. Between pomegranates of fabric were golden bells, and Scripture gives the reason with chilling clarity. Their sound would be heard when the priest entered the sanctuary so that he would not die. Let that settle in. The bells were not there merely for decoration. They were an audible sign of life. As long as the sound continued, the people outside knew the priest was still moving in the presence of God, still standing, still alive. That detail completely changes the atmosphere of the moment. This was not casual religion. This was holy fear, holy precision. A man stepping into sacred space under conditions where silence could mean death. On the priest's forehead rested a plate of pure gold engraved with the words, "Holiness to the Lord." That inscription was not ornamental. It was a declaration, a warning, a reminder that this man did not come in his own name, under his own authority, or on his own terms. He came set apart to serve before the Holy One, and all of these garments had to be made in the desert with extraordinary precision. Measurements had to be exact, materials had to be balanced, threads had to hold, stones had to be placed. Nothing could be careless, because carelessness in the presence of God was deadly. So while the structure of the tabernacle was being prepared and the sacred fabrics were being completed, the priestly garments were also taking shape. Piece by piece, the whole system of worship was coming together. The sanctuary, the coverings, the furniture, the garments, the people, everything was moving toward one moment. The moment when God's house in the desert would finally be assembled for the first time. Then the day finally came. After all the planning, all the carving, all the hammering, all the weaving, all the measuring, there was one final step left. Everything had to be assembled. The tabernacle could not remain a collection of beautiful parts. It had to become a dwelling place, and Exodus 40 gives us the moment with incredible precision. It says this happened on the first day of the first month of the second year, almost exactly 1 year after Israel had come out of Egypt. That means this was not rushed. It was prepared carefully, step by step, until the day arrived when Moses received the final command from God: raise the tabernacle. So the work began. First came the silver bases. Heavy, solid, gleaming in the desert light, they were set carefully on the ground in their exact positions. There could be no careless alignment here. If the bases were wrong, everything built on top of them would be wrong too. Then the gold-covered acacia boards were lifted into place. These were not lightweight pieces. It would have taken multiple men to raise each one and set its lower projections into the silver sockets. Slowly, the walls began to rise. In the middle of the wilderness, a golden framework started taking shape, board by board, as though the desert itself were watching something heaven had designed begin to appear on earth. Then the crossbars were slid through the rings on the boards, locking the structure together. What had been separate pieces now became one body. Strength met design. Precision met purpose. The skeleton of the sanctuary stood in place. After that came the coverings. First, the inner curtains were spread, the finest layer, the most sacred one, woven with cherubim and rich colors. Then above that came the additional coverings, each layer adding protection, function, and meaning. Goat hair, skins dyed red, the outermost covering built to withstand the desert sun, wind, and storm. And once again, the contrast was striking. On the outside, this did not look like the kind of thing the world would call glorious. It looked restrained, covered, almost ordinary. But inside was an entirely different reality. Inside was gold, color, sacred light, beauty, and the visual language of heaven. Then the furniture was brought in. The Ark of the Covenant was placed inside the most holy place. The mercy seat rested above it. The veil was hung, separating the holy place from the most holy place, creating that boundary no ordinary person could cross. The table for the bread of the presence was set in position, with the bread arranged upon it. The lampstand was placed and lit, its 7 flames shining against the gold around it. The altar of incense was set where it belonged, and fragrance began to rise before God. Outside, in the courtyard, the bronze altar was positioned, along with the basin for washing. Everything was now where it was supposed to be. The boards stood, the coverings lay in place, the furnishings were set, the priestly system was ready. Every detail God had spoken on the mountain had now been carried out in the wilderness. But one question remained, and it was the question behind the whole project. Would God accept it? That is the moment where the atmosphere of the story completely shifts. Until now, everything had involved human obedience, human labor, human craftsmanship, human effort offered in response to divine instruction. But no matter how beautiful the result was, no matter how accurate every measurement had been, no matter how carefully Moses had overseen the work, one thing still had to happen. God himself had to come, and then he did. The people gathered outside. You can almost feel the silence of that moment. The desert, usually filled with movement, dust, wind, footsteps, voices, suddenly becomes still in the imagination. Moses had examined everything. The instructions had been followed. The sanctuary stood ready, and then a cloud descended. It came down over the tent of meeting and filled the tabernacle, not symbolically, not poetically, really filled it. The presence of God settled upon the place so powerfully that even Moses could not enter. Think about that. Moses, the man who had stood before the burning bush. Moses, who had climbed Sinai into the presence of God. Moses, who had spoken with the Lord in a way no ordinary man did. Even he could not go in when the glory filled the tabernacle. That tells you everything. This was no longer just a work site, no longer just a remarkable structure, no longer just a sacred national project. It had become an inhabited house. God was there, and from that moment on, the tabernacle became the visible center of Israel's life. Whenever the cloud lifted, the people moved. Whenever the cloud stopped, they stopped. The tabernacle was raised again at every resting place, and the presence of God remained at the center of the camp. Day after day, year after year, through wilderness seasons, uncertainty, travel, waiting, and testing, the people lived around the reality that God was dwelling among them. That simple-looking tent became the center of their direction, their worship, their order, and their identity. For 40 years, this happened over and over again. Think about that. The structure was assembled and disassembled hundreds of times, carried, reset, repositioned, raised again. And through all of it, the design held, the system worked, the holy place remained holy. The presence continued to guide. It was portable but never casual, temporary but never insignificant. And yet, even with all its beauty and importance, the tabernacle was never meant to be the final form of God's dwelling among his people. That is one of the most fascinating things in the whole story. The tabernacle was magnificent, but it was also temporary. It was made for a pilgrim people, a nation still moving, still being led, still not yet settled. It was built for the wilderness, built for transition, built for the journey. Later, when Israel entered the Promised Land, the tabernacle would remain for a long time in places like Shiloh. It would continue to function. It would continue to matter. But over time, a contrast became impossible to ignore. The people began to live in permanent houses while God's ark still rested within curtains. That tension eventually stirred something in David. He looked at his own house and realized something felt incomplete. He was dwelling in cedar while the ark of God was still associated with a tent. David wanted to build a temple, but God told him that this task would belong to his son. And that tells us something important. The tabernacle was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of another chapter. Every board, every curtain, every vessel, every sacrifice, every measurement in the wilderness was pointing forward, forward to the temple, forward to a greater permanence, forward to a deeper revelation of God's relationship with his people. The tabernacle moved, the temple would stand. The tabernacle traveled with a nation in the desert. The temple would rise in Jerusalem. The tabernacle was built for a people on the way. The temple would speak of settlement, kingdom, and permanence. And that is what makes this entire story so powerful. What looked at first like a tent in the wilderness was actually one of the most astonishing acts of sacred construction in the ancient world. It was engineering, artistry, symbolism, worship, obedience, and divine presence all meeting in one place. It was built by former slaves, shaped by God's instruction, sustained in the harshest conditions, and filled with glory. And once you see that, the question at the end becomes impossible to ignore. How did a mobile sanctuary in the desert become the foundation for one of the greatest temple stories in history? That is where the story goes next.